So I think it's about time to get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Thank you for coming to one of the last sessions of the conference on the last day after lunch. Appreciate it. My name is Sarah Ziegenfuss. I am currently a senior Scrum Master and Project Manager at NPR, or National Public Radio. Before that, I spent about 7 years as a consultant at Microsoft, and that's where I started with Agile teams and transformations. So I want to tell you a little bit about NPR, some of the challenges I faced doing an Agile transformation for our DevOps team there, some of the existing process and challenges we ran into, our take on adapting Scrum, our look at Scrum and Kanban, what's next for our DevOps team, some key takeaways, and leaving some time for questions as well. But if you have any questions throughout, feel free to interrupt and just ask them as we go. So, if you're not familiar with NPR, it stands for National Public Radio. It is a nonprofit multimedia organization in the United States. Our mission statement is about creating a better informed public, and we do that through journalism, storytelling, and support for local journalism in the form of public radio stations. We do not do TV, so anything you loved on Masterpiece or Downton was not ours, sorry. These are the domestic locations we have in the U.S. There's about 17 different investigative bureaus and support. And then the diamonds are the public radio stations that we support through access to our flagship programming and various types of technical and digital support. So these are our global locations. Because of our commitment to that better informed public, we're really focused on the ground reporting as many places as we can manage. So the division I work for is focused on enabling storytelling through technology, tools, services, and apps. So what that really breaks down to at NPR is digital services and digital media, the two separate divisions that we had until about 2 years ago when I joined NPR. We had the digital services group, which was based out of Boston, and they supported our member stations, which was a variety of there are about 260 member stations in the country, and they get different types of support from us, help with their websites, access to our programming, that sort of thing. But there was also at NPR HQ in Washington, D.C., our support for our own division, the npr.org website, other divisions within the company, the internal content management system for the newsroom, the audio archive for our archivists, our various podcasts, and of course our apps. So there was a fair amount of digital work going on in 2 different locations. And in 2017, about 2 weeks after I joined the company, our chief digital officer announced that there was going to be a merger between these 2 divisions, which did make a lot of sense. There was a lot of overlap in some of the work they were doing, but it also meant that there would be a lot more work happening for the sysadmin team that was based out of HQ. So there were 4 people on that team who were already supporting these different groups, the product groups within our own division, the newsroom, and various other groups. And now they would be taking on a new stack, different technology, and trying to get knowledge transfer from our colleagues in Boston who had chosen not to relocate. So there were already some existing issues with just growth issues for the team as the division and digital for public radio had been expanding. There had been some challenges with how they were handling the increased workflow, and now they were about to get a whole lot more of it dumped on them. So even though I was new, they were also a little bit short on Scrum Masters. So they asked me to coach this team through becoming Agile. And it seemed to make sense to me, and I was like, that would be great. Let me start talking to the team and get their perspective on it. They were less thrilled, less excited for sure. They were already feeling overwhelmed. They were facing a ton of institutional change. And, this merger was going on. And now they had this brand new Scrum Master who'd been there 3 weeks at this point, saying like, hey, we're going to do this completely new thing. We're going to do Agile. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. There was not perhaps an immediate enthusiasm for adopting this framework. So I backed up a step and started talking to the different people about their perspectives on the change. So the sysadmin lead had been there for a while, I think 10 years at that point. People tend to stick around. And his perspective was that they didn't need a process. They just talked to each other. Everything got done. We don't need to change anything. It's fine. Like, he just really thought that even with the merger coming in, even with some of the challenges that other teams had getting support from them, it's fine. And that was one perspective. But since I'd been asked to coach the team, and since I was hearing things from other coworkers, other Scrum masters, stakeholders, I thought there was probably a little bit more to it. So I talked to some other team members. One of the other senior sysadmins was actually really frustrated with how things were going at that point. He didn't know if he could work on a project that was more complicated or took some focus time, or if he was going to be interrupted and asked to help someone or fix something, or, if a production issue came up, was he supposed to handle it, or was someone else on the team supposed to handle it? It just didn't feel like it was clear to him, and so it was really frustrating as he was trying to get work done. The developers on the product teams in the division were also a little bit unsure of how to get the best support from the sysadmin group. Sysadmins handled their dev boxes, their virtual development machines, and there were some problems with them. And so if they ever needed help, one of the tactics was just find someone in the hallway, grab them, ask them for help. Worked for the developer, a little frustrating for them, a lot frustrating for the sysadmins. And then there was all kinds of stakeholder feedback. One of the most chilling pieces was like, we just email one sysadmin directly. He set up this specific tool for us. He's the only one who knows how it works. I don't know that everyone else even knew that tool existed. So there are definitely some challenges, and there are some challenges related to sort of the black box aspect of ops work. Requests came in, time passed, stuff happened, something came out. So that really seemed like one of the challenges that Scrum could fix. But I was still dealing with the resistance from people who were like, our existing process is fine. So I wanted to really dig into that and understand what worked for them about that process and what didn't, and if maybe there was more to it than I was seeing right away. So I went back to our sysadmin lead, and I sat down and I talked with him, and his perception of the process was, there is a stakeholder. They have a task. They give it to the sysadmins. We get it done. That's fine. That's all there is. We don't need to overly complicate this or add any steps. So one of the things that can happen when you're at a company for a long time or doing work the same way for a long time is that your mind starts skipping over all the little in-between steps in a process that you're really familiar with, because you don't have to think, how does that task get to the sysadmins? How do they work on it? How does the stakeholder know that they're working on it? You're so familiar with it that it's really, you're not seeing these steps. He wasn't being like purposefully resistant or stubborn. He was just so familiar that a lot of the in-between work was disappearing. So we dug into it a little further. How does this actually happen? Well, it turns out that one of the ways was the stakeholder could send an email to the shared inbox for all of the sysadmins. And at this point, they had to figure out who was going to reply and how they were going to handle it. So this could vary. Sometimes one person would see it and jump on it right away. Sometimes no one would jump on it for a little while until maybe a follow-up email. Sometimes two people would reply without knowing the other person had replied. But eventually, someone picks it up. And usually in that initial email, there wasn't quite enough information for them to complete the task, so they would absolutely have to go back, email the stakeholder again, get some more information from them, probably exchange some, can you test this now? What about this? Can you try this? But they're working on the task, and eventually it does get done. But at the same time, the rest of the team has no idea what happened. That work disappeared for them as well. They just, that person was working on it. I think it's done. What changes did they make? What's different in our systems? Not entirely sure. So after having these conversations and reviewing the difference, it became clear that there was more to the existing process than people were thinking about, and that it was a lot more complicated, and there might be some ways to simplify it and improve it, and there might be some ways that we could use Agile to do that. Because that wasn't all, they also had a Slack channel. People would drop into the Slack channel and try and contact all the sysadmins there. They had direct messages. Just ping someone that you were friendlier with and ask them if they could take care of this for you real quick. And then there were the in-person conversations, which meant that, let alone not having an email or a Slack record, there was just no record that work had ever happened. If it was an important change, if someone had gotten to it, we didn't know. So at this point, I was pretty convinced that adapting Scrum would really be able to help them. I was envisioning all of these different types of input coming into one system, being in one place. The team could look at them together. It was going to be great. They were going to have a much simpler way of working. They were going to have really increased visibility, and it was going to be so much better for them. Is everyone here, who here uses Scrum, knows about Scrum? Familiar? All right, I'm going to skip these two. So this is for my audiences who are not as familiar with Scrum, but really what I wanted to do was, the rest of the division was using the whole framework. Let's try that. Let's adopt everything. Let's start putting stuff in tickets. Let's have a backlog, planning, retrospective, everything. I really was enthusiastic about the changes and the possibility that we could solve all their problems. They were less so. It was one of those things where I was just coming at it with a little too much, a little too fast for the team, and they had a valid reason to push back on it. That's really, something that I think sometimes when you're trying to lead change, you don't consider that resistance comes from a place of something. People don't actually want their jobs to be harder. They want, if you have a solution for them, they're interested in it. If they're not interested in it, it's probably something that's coming from you that you don't understand fully or that you need to change in your approach. So that's what I did. You can't make change happen alone. You need allies, people who are interested in also making these changes and seeing what's going on and helping you from within the team itself. Trying to impose change from the top down, it just never works. You can get some grudging acceptance, potentially some lip service, but it's not actually going to solve problems. And if you don't have that support, change your approach. And that's what I tried to do. I took into account their feedback, and it was, we have a lot of change happening. There's this institutional shift, this merger, we have new leadership. You're asking for too much from us too quickly. It's not going to help us. We don't see how adding, stopping everything that we do currently and doing everything new in a different way is going to be good for us. And that made sense to me, I hadn't seen it from that perspective, in part because I was so new, but that made a lot of sense. So we changed it up a little bit. Decided to go a little bit slower and see if we could move more quickly to a state where change wasn't slowing them down anymore, it was actually helping them speed up. We didn't have the option of not doing anything different because we had the merger and because of some of the existing issues that had been raised for the team. We needed to do something. However, contrary to my initial approach, we didn't need to make all of the changes right away. It was fine to kind of pick through and see what was going to be most helpful. So after listening to the perspectives, both within the team, which was really important, but also with the stakeholders and people who had trouble kind of working with or reaching or communicating with the team, we decided that some of the key improvements would be getting all of our work in one place so it wasn't in these 5 distributed channels, Slack messages, etc. Regular team communication, just a time and place for everyone to talk to each other about what they were working on, get help, make sure that their changes weren't going to conflict with each other, that sort of thing. And better visibility to the work both for the team and for the stakeholders so that they could see how much this team was actually handling at one point. It's really hard to convey that sense when the tracking of the work is spread throughout so many different channels. So this was an overwhelmed team, but they were having trouble communicating that because in order to pull it all together, they had to go through, you saw we get these requests come in through Slack. I had this person pinging me. This person stopped me in the hallway to ask. It's difficult to communicate that. So after some more conversations, we decided to start with just a Scrum board and stand-ups, and that would be it. Just a chance for everyone to talk about the work, no preparation required for the meeting, even though it was an additional meeting, and the Scrum board for everyone to look at. So this did require changing behavior, as exemplified by my puppy. And that was a challenge, even with this minimal amount of change, even with just taking the way work came in, how we tracked it, and where, we talked about it, there was still change for the team. They had to change how they tracked their work and talked about it. And stakeholders had to change how they made requests, and that required some support and coordination from more than just the team. One of the things I did was recruit my fellow Scrum Masters for support. There were Scrum Masters for the other product teams in the division and those product teams would often need assistance from the sysadmins. So because we were all coworkers as well, I was asking them to help me with this process change, remind them to make tickets, remind them to alert the team leader that this ticket's been created and that you need to work on it, that sort of thing. I also just straight up created tickets at stand-up. People were a little reluctant at first, and if they were talking about something that wasn't on the board, I would just take the 30 seconds right there and create a ticket for them. So eventually it became faster for them to either start it themselves or be like, oh, can we write this down right now? I forgot to put it on the board. And I think one of the other important things that I was able to do was act as a buffer for the team to ask for tickets. It's really difficult if you've got a working relationship with someone, maybe someone senior, maybe someone you're friends with, helped you out, done some favors in the past, to be like, actually, I can't take care of this for you really quickly unless you fill out a ticket and put it on our board. So it was much easier for them if they could be like, hey, I really want to do this for you. Can you just make a ticket real quick? Or otherwise Sarah's going to yell at me at Scrum or ask for it or whatever. I didn't mind being the bad guy in that situation because, that's my role, to help the team go through these changes and to support them when they're asking for anything that will help them do their work. So we ended up with a new team motto: no ticket, no work. But after all of this hard work, we also ended up with a Scrum board. This is a mock-up, but it was pretty close to what we had that was kind of just all over the place. There was a lot in progress. There was a lot that was just open column because we weren't really doing planning yet. And it was kind of visually overwhelming. We weren't getting a clear idea of what our priorities were. We were talking about the work. There was some improvement, but it wasn't great. So we needed to keep adapting. The first thing that was really important for the team was not to give up at the first iteration. It would have been super easy to be like, hey, Scrum's not working for us, doesn't work, no good, we're going to toss it out and try something else. But there was stuff that was working. We had regular team communication. We were seeing less duplication of effort, less conflicting changes, some knowledge sharing and transfer from the people in the previous team. So there were parts of this that were working. And really what made sense was to build on what was working instead of trying to start over from scratch. So one of the first things we did was add retrospectives. It was another piece of the Scrum framework to pull in, but it was an easier sell because it was a constructive avenue for complaints, and people like to complain. So that worked out pretty well. And in our retrospectives, we were talked through as a team the best ways to solve some of our problems around prioritization, visualization of the work, and decided to try adding epics and swim lanes to the board as our next step. So this was an improvement for us, for sure. As you can see, visually it's a little bit clearer what our priorities were, and it's a little bit easier to see the work that was coordinated and made sense together. But you can also see that we still had a lot on the board, and we were still handling those issues that kind of flowed in unplanned, disrupted the work, people needing immediate assistance, production issues, that sort of thing. So we were still having some challenges with those. We were also trying to, because of some of the deadlines around the migration, add in some planning, and that was constantly being disrupted by the unplanned work because we could just never calculate accurately how much time we would have in a sprint to do this work and how much time would need to be devoted to ops work that we couldn't account for ahead of time. So that's when we decided to move towards considering Scrum and Kanban. assuming people are also familiar with Kanban, but one of the reasons that our team was interested in it was the limiting of work in progress, because there tended to be on the team like picking up whatever came in addition to your project work, and then all of a sudden you've got 5 different things going on at once, and you're not focused really on any of them. But there was also some debate about leaving Scrum behind because it was working well for us in some ways. And some of the good points of Scrum for our team was that it could handle the project work that required planning and coordination. At this point, we were trying to wrap up some of that merger work and return to some of our more complicated upgrades and system support. And it was really great to be able to work with the affected product teams on that sprint cycle. The rest of the division was on the sprint cycle, and that was really, a good point for us there. However, there was also the ability of Kanban to maybe handle some of that interrupt-based work a little better. The work that kind of flowed in, it needed to be handled immediately, it couldn't really be put off, and it also wasn't tied to a sprint cycle or a code release. So that was one of the things that we considered, and after a vigorous discussion at one of the retrospectives, we decided to go for both. There really wasn't a reason not to. There were points from both frameworks that worked out really well from us, and at that point, the only thing that was holding us back was their different frameworks. And that really kind of made me think about, Agile was created to get away from some of the overly restrictive business practices, and it didn't make sense to me to say we can't pull these 2 pieces together because they're from different frameworks, and you got to follow the framework. And that's a little rigid and doesn't feel like it's actually true Agile. So we decided that we were going to try an implementation of Kanban along with our Scrum. And here's a little bit more about what that turned out to be like for us. So because all of the ops work we were getting tended to come in from either our systems or requests from other teams, we created a portal that we would put on top of the Kanban board. People could go to the portal, select the kind of issue they were having. Is it a system problem? Do you need help with kind of a routine task? Do you need access to one of the systems? That was a big recurring one. Or do you just have a question? And so what this would do then is take this information and become the single point of entry for all of the unplanned work, because we had these different types for people to come and use. And then we would collect the necessary information for each type of work up front. So, it would help us cut down on the I need access to a system. Oh, I actually need access to these 5 systems now that you've given me access to this first one, the back and forth email chain. Or if you needed help with a standard task, we could make sure we had all of the information and didn't need to go back to you and interrupt your workday again in order to get started on it. And the way we decided to handle this is that our on-call sysadmin would automatically be assigned to these tickets through the board we were using at the time, and they would triage them, handle what they could. If it was a longer or more complicated request or something that really needed some project work behind it, we could transfer it to our other board, but generally for that 2-week sprint, they would do the best they could at handling all of those problems. This also, because we were using the board with the automatic updates, users could either go to the portal, track their requests there, or get the automatic updates as we moved it through, as we made comments, etc., so that they would know who was working on it and that it was being worked on and not just ignored. So this kind of model ended up looking at 2 types of work, 2 types of boards. So we would go every day and stand up and go through our Kanban board first. The on-call sysadmin would talk about, these are the problems I'm handling, so that the rest of the team knew what was coming on in, what they were aware of, what changes they were making, so that none of it was happening in isolation or without visibility from the team into what system changes we were making, because they needed to have that information. And if, they were getting up to their work in progress limit, we would see if anyone had a little bit of downtime in their project work where they could maybe take something routine off the board to help out that sysadmin. And then we would move over to our Scrum board, We would go through that in the usual stand-up fashion, talking through the stories in progress, and the on-call sysadmin would then remain connected to the project work, so after their 2-week sprint on the service desk board was over, they could move back into project work and no one got stuck being the help desk person forever or needing to ramp back up on projects once they started getting back into that. This really ended up working out pretty well for us because, the way that we're doing DevOps within our division, it's not really one thing or the other, so having just one board didn't work for us. The double model is going well so far. We've also found some other advantages that we were not expecting from using both Scrum and Kanban. One of them has been a training tool. As our division grows and as people just cycle through your teams, it's been really helpful to have new team members after their initial onboarding take about a 2-week cycle on the service desk board and handle some of the range of problems that come in. We support a lot of different teams, a lot of different systems, and this kind of hands-on introduction to them has been really valuable in getting people up to speed quickly on the various things that they might not touch otherwise through a project or through just a general shadowing. It's really helped with our planning problems because we've got one person whose capacity is pretty dedicated to the service desk. We can count their capacity towards that for the sprint, and the rest of the team members can estimate their stories and plan for their capacity for their sprint. It's also really limited that context switching that was helping to disrupt our planning and estimation and the distractions. If a ticket comes in midday after Scrum, we know who the first person to look at it's going to be, and we know it's their responsibility to contact other team members if they need assistance or if it becomes an all-hands-on-deck situation, which hopefully it does not. It hasn't eliminated them, of course, because I don't know of a system that completely eliminates context switching and distractions. If you do, I'd love to hear about it. But it's really helped the team be able to focus and move forward with their own projects, their own updates to technology, research new solutions that they're interested in ways that they hadn't had time for before because they were just really focused on putting out fires. And I think one of the other important things it did, especially as far as the rest of the division goes, is it removed the black box aspect of our work. For a lot of people, they just didn't understand. They knew our team was busy. They didn't understand what the team was doing. And so it could be a little bit frustrating for them. I need this request. I don't understand why no one's even emailed me back yet. So now they would submit a ticket. Someone would be assigned to it right away. If they were curious about why maybe it hadn't been moved over, they can go to the board and they can see, oh, hey, 10 other tickets came in at the same hour. I understand why mine's not being worked on yet. Or they can ask, why is this being prioritized ahead of mine? I know that they don't need this for another 2 weeks. So it allows us to have communication about the prioritization and communication about the team workload that's based on a visualization of the actual work. And again, I think one of the key things is that it's improved the visibility of work within the team. A lot of the times, prior to kind of trying to come up with this new process, team members would be like, oh, there's a problem. I'm going to go off and figure out a way to solve it. I'm going to implement my solution, and then I'm on to the next thing. And that wouldn't necessarily be talked about with the rest of the team. Maybe it's a great solution. Maybe there was a simpler way they could have done it. Maybe it's going to cause a problem with something over here, but we just didn't have any way of talking about that, and it could occasionally cause problems, and that's been greatly reduced, and it's also really helped some of the newer and junior members of our team learn from the other work that's going on. Sure.
Do you still have commitment from the team if you have both approaches, or do you time box Kanban?
Yeah, we do have commitment for the team on both approaches. I'm not sure what you mean by the time.
No, I mean commitment for this. If you have a sprint.
Oh, no. So for the Kanban, we don't have a commitment to how much work gets done. We focus on reducing our cycle time, the time from open to complete. But if it's work that looks like it's going to be longer or more complicated, we move it over to our Scrum board and make it part of our project work and commit to it and time box it in that way. The Kanban board is really about handling the ops tickets that need to be handled immediately pretty much, or are not as time consuming, access requests for the systems. We do a lot of support for various other divisions that is fairly routine. Podcast launches require a lot of like redirects and support within our systems for that sort of thing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So now focusing on what's next, because in Agile DevOps, it's never actually over. So one of the things that we're trying is embedding. It's an NPR podcast, but it's also something we're trying out with having our sysadmins work directly in product teams. There are product teams that need longer term, more complicated support. We recently had a team that was breaking out some of our microservices and moving them to the cloud, and they really needed a sysadmin to work with them on setting up those environments. So the way that we are testing that out is we're having a DevOps team member join that product team full-time, scrums with them, goes to their plannings, etc., but remain connected to DevOps through attending the DevOps Scrum as well and peer review on both sides. As the DevOps team members back on the DevOps team are completing work, we ask other team members to review it just so they understand what's done and check the work. And the tickets that the DevOps member who's embedded in the product team is completing would then also be reviewed by other DevOps team members. So it's a little bit complicated, but what we're trying to do there is make sure that no one gets overly isolated or specialized in a way they might not want to be, and that all the DevOps team members still have visibility into other things that the team is doing, and no one ends up being the one person who knows how this works. So anytime that team needs changes, fixes, support going forward, they can only go to one person. We want to be able to give product teams the specific need, the extra support that they need, but we don't want to isolate the work or the team member, make it harder for them to get back into other projects, or make them end up as kind of the default support person for that team. So, how I built this NPR podcast, but also something that we are trying to bring a little bit more dev into DevOps. As I said when we started, the team was sysadmins to begin with, and we've recently added a team member from a development background to bring a little bit more of the dev into DevOps. And that's been a really beneficial thing for the team because they have to have more conversations from the other perspective, because there can be a little bit frustrating when one of the things that we're working on is containerization of the virtual development environments, the dev boxes. And that really benefits from both perspectives because, the developer can say, yeah, it's a pain that we need to do it this way, but here's why. Or, yeah, no, I understand. Maybe I can refactor it so it's a little bit easier for us to containerize that particular piece. And the sysadmins have an understanding of maybe some of the legacy code that the developers are dealing with that's making it a little bit harder for them to do things that are easier to support. And Invisibilia, NPR podcast, but also something we're trying with invisible work. So maintenance work and recurring tasks have been a little challenging for us to fit into an Agile framework. They're not generally stories that have a clear end. They're not part of a larger epic always. So it's sometimes difficult to get them prioritized or to remember to fit them into a sprint. Or if you're sitting in planning, talking about what you want to do in the next sprint, looking through your epics, you don't always think, one of the things we should really do is optimize our AWS account, make sure we're keeping our costs down there. But it's really important work. So one of the things that we're testing out is a recurring work epic for that kind of maintenance and periodic tasks so that we remember to, as a team, prioritize that, pull it into sprints, and that it's also visual work for our stakeholders and other team members, because that is the kind of work that takes time, needs to be done, but it's not very glamorous, so it's easy to deprioritize or to, not count it when you're talking about your team's capacity or what they need to get done. So then there are a few takeaways that I had from the overall experience that I wanted to share. And one of them was that if you're asked to lead or deal with change, take the time to dig into the perception and the reality of the current state. I have had to lead changes, in a couple of different environments. And the thing I've learned sometimes after running into some brick walls is that, the perception of the current state really matters to the team members, and it's really important for you to understand that. And it's also important for you to encourage them to understand what that looks like to other people and the process that they might be dealing with. But I think it's really just if you're being asked to deal with a big change, trying to understand why people are asking it of you. There might be a reason, there might not be a good enough reason. You might be able to push back, or you might be able to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And then I think this is another one that's really key to reiterate, because a lot of times, I think as a Scrum Master, and I think sometimes as like a dev lead, you're kind of asked to hey, we need this team to do this differently, go make it happen. And that is not really an effective way to make change. It's really frustrating, and it tends to, rightly have the team be less interested in working with you, less interested in trusting you, and less interested in believing that you can really help them solve their problems. So if you don't have allies, if people that you are working with are not excited about the changes, or at least interested in the changes, I think it's really important to change your approach. You might be doing something wrong. You might be doing too much. And if, and see how you can change their minds, because it's about listening to people and trusting that people really do want to do the best job they can. They want their work to be interesting and enjoyable, and no one is deliberately saying, I think this does sound like it would make my job easier, but I just don't want to do it. So if you're meeting with that kind of resistance, there's something about what or how you're communicating that you need to change. And then it is almost always faster to go slow, even when you're dealing with institutional pressure or change. And this is a harder one, because there are situations in which it's really difficult to say to management, to someone who's brought you in as a coach or an expert, or someone who's like, I really need to see this team, change, that trying to force perhaps an entire Agile framework on them out of the blue is not the best way to go about it, but that actually taking those small incremental steps, taking the time for the team to see actual benefit from them, for the team to see that you're willing to change things up and adapt to their feedback, you're going to get to a better place, and you're going to get there faster, with a higher team morale and with more actual adoption than you would if you just tried to kind of impose change from above and do it as quickly as possible. And this was another one that for me as an Agile practitioner was really interesting, because there has been sort of a discussion about you got to do Scrum, you got to do Kanban, you can only do Lean, you should try SAFe, there's a roadmap. But really, for me, it's about finding what works for your team and not worrying if it comes from different frameworks or doesn't follow established practice. The established practice has only been established for, a few years at this point, and it had to get started somewhere. The innovations and adaptations that your team makes are going to be what serves it best, and could eventually end up being useful to other teams as well, which is how some of these frameworks came to be. And then I think finally, and really importantly, is to just keep trying things. It's really easy to get to an okay place and just kind of coast a little bit. And there was some temptation to do that when we hit the point where we had a board, it had epics, it had swim lanes, we were doing some planning, we were doing okay. It was an improvement from where we'd been, for sure. People were happier with it, but it wasn't, really doing what we needed in terms of prioritization and context switching. So we kept messing with it. We kept trying things. We kept tinkering a little bit, and it got us to a much better place. And we wouldn't have gotten there with the benefits of having both boards, with the additional teaching tool, with the additional visibility that we got out of adding Kanban, if we'd been content to stay with good enough. So that's really, what I took away from this experience, and I hope it is helpful to you as well. And I've left some time, so I hope there are questions. Yeah, thank you. I think I saw a hand.
You didn't mention the product owner before the transition. position there, I suppose you didn't have any product owner. How was that fixed? And how was the relationship between the team and the product owner?
So that's a really great question because it's been kind of a complicated situation. I wasn't sure I had time for it, but I've got some time now. So the senior sysadmin lead became the lead/product owner, and that's something that we're kind of still working out because it's a very collaborative team. Each member of the team has a lot of ideas about how we should do things, a lot of ideas about where we should go next. So our planning and prioritization tends to be much more collaborative, and what we have is kind of like the point of contact for the team is our product owner, and they do have more or less the final say on what we prioritize and where we move next. But any member of the team can drive forward projects that they think have value, try and like sell them to the rest of the team and we kind of move forward with that, or sell them to the rest of the division and we try and move forward with that. The containerization of dev boxes is actually something that the developer who joined our team came with as like the thing that he really wanted to do because it had been a pain point for him. And, he pitched it to the team. They were like, yeah, I think this is good. Our product owner was like, I don't think it's going to displace anything more pressing, so let's go ahead with it. But yeah, no, it's definitely different than a product-based team, and I don't know if that's just our team's personality or how it's evolved, but it's continuing to work for us right now.
How long have you been working with your particular team?
A little over 2 years. So yeah, they were one of the first teams I got when I started, and we're still hanging out. Yeah.
How popular was the no ticket, no work?
Mixed reviews, for sure. There was some stress about it, and there were some product owners and other team members who were like, I don't understand why I have to submit a ticket when for years I've just been asking them, letting them know that this is coming up and I need them to do it. But I think one of the things that helped me get past that was like, hey, if you ask in this particular way, this is what you're going to get from it. You're going to see who's working on it right away. You're going to know the progress of it without having to find that person individually, ask them what's up, ask them when it's going to be done. You're going to have a way to get in contact with them that's just like leave a comment on the ticket and move on. So let's try it and see how it goes. And if there's ever something urgent, like if it's really truly like things are breaking, you can absolutely alert the team and we'll just create the ticket afterwards, but we want that record of the work. So it definitely took some patience, some persistence, and some of me being the voice of the Slack channel being like, oh, yeah, we can do that. Is there a ticket for that by chance? And having the product owner then fill one out. Sorry.
Did you do most of that kind of umbrella?
I did a lot of it because we hadn't had a defined product owner role on the team, and because our sysadmin lead was sort of growing into that product owner role. That was it, and because I was in a lot of leading of the transformation, I did a lot of the umbrella work for sure.
Just wondered if you met any resistance from the team when they were filling out the tickets to put enough information into them?
For the teams on for.
With your team when they were writing the tickets?
Oh yeah, putting enough information on the ticket initially was a challenge for sure, and it was one of those things where I wasn't going to force them to start with, as a sysadmin, I would like to do X so I could do Y. It started out as being kind of just notes about the project that they were working on, and then as it got more confusing to talk about it that way in stand-up, I'd be like, okay, I'm having a little trouble following this, so I'm just going to take some notes while you talk about it. And then that slowed everyone down enough that it became faster and easier for them to just add the notes to the ticket themselves as they were creating it, or to add tasks as they were creating it and as we were going through and updating it. But yeah, it was one of those things that just took time and trying not to force it on anyone until they saw the benefits.
Where do you see the shortcomings of the current solution, or still improvement for the future?
Oh yeah, there's always room for improvement for the future.
Where do you see from
Where?
your perspective?
I think one of the things that we've gotten into with like some of our new team members and some of the project work is that we're our focus is on too many things at once, and our current system on the Scrum project side is really kind of enabling that. We don't have a limit, a work in progress limit for projects. So we've got, I think, a little too many projects going on. So, we'll have our board with the work separated into epics, and we'll have like 7, 8 epics on there. We only have 7 or 8 team members. So that's probably too much, but we don't really have a way to go over that or flag it or talk about it yet, and that's something that I think we need to work on. All right. Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Did you consider having just like a Kanban board and building Scrum practices around that? Instead of 2 boards?
Yeah, we had considered that, but the visual clutter for us was a little bit too much, and trying to have both the Kanban board with the items for immediate release, for immediate production, as well as the board that was kind of related to the sprint cycle for the rest of the division didn't really work out for us, but it could absolutely work out for other teams.
You mentioned before that you bring over bigger tasks to the Scrum board, but you don't do this in the same sprint, do you?
No, those have to be,
Protecting the sprint.
yeah, we're protecting the sprint. So they move over, to be precise, they move over to the to the product backlog for the Scrum board, and then we prioritize it in the next planning. All right. Well, if those are all the questions, thank you very much. I will post my slides, and please feel free to contact me with any follow-up. Thank you.